The stone beneath your feet shifts with a grinding whisper that echoes through darkness so absolute it feels alive. Your torch, no, the arcane lantern hanging from your hip, casts a pale, sickly glow across walls that shouldn't exist, carved from rock older than human memory. Each step deeper into the labyrinth brings a sensation that crawls along your spine. You are trespassing in spaces meant to remain forever sealed. The air itself tastes of antiquity and secrets, thick with the dust of civilizations ground to powder by time's inexorable march. Welcome, lore-seekers, to another deep dive with Keen 7 lore, where today we descend into one of Bloodborne's most enigmatic mysteries, the true purpose of the Chalice dungeons. These sprawling underground labyrinths represent far more than optional endgame content or farming grounds for blood gems. They are the foundation upon which all of Yharnam's tragedy is built, the ancient crime scene where humanity first glimpsed truths that should have remained buried. But here's the question that gnaws at the edges of understanding like the maddening whispers of the Great Ones themselves. Were these impossibly vast dungeons designed as prisons to contain cosmic horrors? Or were they sanctuaries meant to preserve and protect beings beyond mortal comprehension? The answer, as we'll discover through blood-stained corridors and past the weeping ghosts of a lost civilization, may be both and neither, simultaneously. The Pthumerians, those towering, pale architects of these underground realms, left behind more than just stone and ritual. They left a warning written in the very architecture of their creation, a warning the healing church would later ignore to catastrophic consequence. At the heart of this mystery stands a figure both tragic and terrifying. Queen Yharnam herself, eternally pregnant, forever mourning, her chains broken, yet her prison inescapable. Consider for a moment what it means to break a seal that has held for millennia. The Chalice ritual doesn't simply open a door, it tears through barriers between what is and what should never be, using blood as both key and sacrifice. Every hunter who performs this ritual becomes complicit in an ancient violation, repeating the sins of Bergenworth's scholars, who first dared to delve where even the Pthumerians feared to tread. The dungeons themselves seem to remember every transgression, reshaping their corridors and chambers based on who dares to enter, as if the very stones judge each intruder and manifest appropriate punishment or reward. The physical impossibility of these spaces defies conventional understanding. Descending through layer after layer, each more ancient and terrible than the last, hunters find themselves in chambers that couldn't possibly exist beneath Yharnam's foundations. Yet they do exist, occupying space that belongs more to nightmare than reality, where the architecture follows dream logic rather than physical law. The deeper you go, the more apparent it becomes that these aren't merely underground tombs. They're dimensional anchors, holding something in place across multiple planes of existence. When we examine the Pthumerian civilization that created these labyrinths, we're looking at beings who achieved something both miraculous and catastrophic. These weren't primitive tomb builders working with simple tools and superstition. The Pthumerians were, according to the most reliable accounts found in ancient texts and blood memories, superhuman entities who had unlocked what they called the wisdom of the eldritch truth. Their relationship with the Great Ones transcended worship. It was symbiotic, transformative, and ultimately destructive. The evidence suggests the earliest Pthumerians served as guardians, but guardians of what, exactly? Were they protecting the Great Ones from the world above, or protecting that world from the sleeping gods below? Their society evolved from simple custodianship to something far more complex, eventually proclaiming rulership and establishing a capital within the labyrinth itself. This transformation from servants to sovereigns marks a crucial turning point in understanding the dungeon's purpose. The Pthumerians didn't just tend to these spaces, they inhabited them, raised families within them, built entire civilizations in the darkness between dreams and waking. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Bloodborne's darkest mysteries so far, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. It makes a real difference in helping this video reach fellow hunters and lore enthusiasts through YouTube's algorithm. Your support means everything and helps keep these in-depth explorations of gaming's richest mythologies coming. The Keeper of the Old Lords stands as perhaps the most telling example of Pthumerian dedication to their purpose. These beings underwent a ritual known as flame ceremony, where their bodies were cremated while their consciousness remained intact, bound eternally to their duty. Imagine the dedication required to willingly become an undying sentinel, forever guarding passages that lead to truths that drove entire civilizations mad. The Keepers wield fire not as a weapon, but as a sacred tool, maintaining the boundaries between the material and the immaterial, between what sleeps and what must never wake. Fire holds special significance in Pthumerian culture, representing both purification and preservation. The ritual flames don't simply burn, they transform, creating states of being that exist between life and death. This mastery over elemental forces suggests the Pthumerians understood fundamental aspects of reality that modern Yharnam has only begun to glimpse through blood ministration. Their pyromancy wasn't crude magic, but sophisticated manipulation of cosmic forces, turning flesh into eternal vessels for consciousness that transcends physical limitation. The architectural marvels within these dungeons tell their own story of purpose and intent. Every chamber serves multiple functions simultaneously: tomb, laboratory, prison cell, throne room. The overlapping purposes create spaces that feel wrong to human perception, where ceremonial altars double as surgical tables, where throne rooms become execution chambers, where nurseries transform into sacrificial pits. This multiplicity of function suggests the Pthumerians understood that in dealing with great ones, singular purpose becomes meaningless. Everything must serve every purpose because the beings they built for exist across multiple states of reality simultaneously. Consider the seals themselves, those intricate barriers that require blood sacrifice to breach. Modern scholars from the Healing Church believe these were simple locks, puzzles left by a dead civilization. But the evidence points to something far more sophisticated and disturbing. The seals don't just bar physical passage, they maintain dimensional stability, keeping separate things that should never touch. When a hunter breaks these seals with chalice rituals, they're not opening doors so much as collapsing barriers between states of existence. The blood requirement isn't payment or fuel, it's a medium through which consciousness can bridge the gap between the material and the cosmic. If you're finding value in unraveling these ancient mysteries and understanding the true horror beneath Yharnam's streets, consider subscribing to join our growing community of lore seekers. Your support truly makes these deep investigations into gaming's most complex mythologies possible, and there's so much more darkness to explore together. The labyrinth's tendency to reshape itself based on who enters reveals perhaps the most unsettling aspect of its nature. These aren't static tombs, but reactive spaces that respond to consciousness itself. Two hunters entering through the same chalice might find completely different configurations, as if the dungeons themselves are testing, judging, or perhaps feeding on the minds that dare to enter. Some scholars theorize the dungeons are actually a single vast organism, an architectural entity that exists across multiple dimensions, showing different faces to different observers while maintaining its essential nature: containment. This brings us to the tragic figure at the heart of the mystery: Queen Yharnam herself. When encountered in the deepest reaches of the Labyrinth, she appears simultaneously as prisoner and sovereign, victim and threat. Her wrists bear the marks of shackles, yet she moves with otherworldly grace. Her white dress, stained with blood that never dries, suggests both wedding gown and burial shroud. Most disturbing of all, she remains eternally pregnant with the child, Mergo, despite that child existing elsewhere in the nightmare. This temporal impossibility suggests her prison exists outside normal causality, a pocket of frozen time where past, present, and future collapse into a single, eternal moment of loss. The red stains spreading from her womb tell a story of violence that transcends physical trauma. Queen Yharnam didn't simply lose a child. She had one torn from her very being to serve purposes beyond human comprehension. The evidence strongly indicates this was done against her will, transforming what should have been birth into something far more sinister. Mergo wasn't just born. Mergo was harvested, transformed, elevated, or condemned to existence as something neither fully Pthumerian nor fully Great One, caught forever between states of being. The handcuffs she wears and eventually breaks free from during the encounter suggest layers of imprisonment. Physical restraints for a being who exists partially outside physical reality seem almost insulting in their inadequacy. Yet they serve their purpose for untold ages, holding not just her body, but her will, her rage, her grief. When she finally breaks free during battle, it's not simple metal that shatters, but conceptual chains, the breaking of which sends ripples through dimensions. Every hunter who witnesses this liberation becomes complicit in an ancient tragedy, replaying itself eternally in a space where time has no meaning. Her presence in multiple locations throughout the game world, glimpsed in Yharnam's streets during the blood moon, standing before Mergo's loft, weeping blood in the dungeons, suggests she exists in a state of dimensional fragmentation. Parts of her consciousness are scattered across reality like light through a prism, each reflection showing a different aspect of her eternal suffering. The Queen Yharnam in the dungeons might be the original, the physical form from which all other manifestations spring, or she might be just another echo, another fragment of a being torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. The relationship between Queen Yharnam and her child Mergo represents one of Bloodborne's most complex narrative threads. Mergo exists as a great one, or at least something approaching that state, cradled by the wet nurse in a nightmare realm accessible only through dream and madness. Yet in the dungeons, in that space where time stands still, Yharnam remains pregnant, the child still within her. This paradox suggests multiple timelines collapsed into one, or perhaps reveals that what was taken from her was not just a child, but the very concept of that child, leaving her eternally bearing an absence that has shape and weight. The transformation of Mergo from Pthumerian royalty to infant Great One represents the ultimate violation of natural order. The process by which this occurred remains shrouded in mystery, but evidence points to deliberate action by the Pthumerian leadership, possibly Yharnam herself, before she understood the true cost. The Great Ones, we know, lose their children and yearn for surrogates. Did the Pthumerians offer Mergo as a living sacrifice to maintain their covenant with the cosmos? Or was Mergo stolen, transformed against all will, into something that could bridge the gap between mortal and divine? The wet nurse, that nightmare creature of wings and blades that serves as Mergo's guardian adds another layer to this mystery. This being appears to be neither Pthumerian nor Great One, but something artificially created to serve a specific purpose, maintaining Mergo's existence in a state between life and death, dream and waking. The wet nurse's form, shrouded and multiple-armed, suggests a creature designed for a single purpose: to nurture what should not exist, to maintain what should naturally fade, to preserve what was never meant to be. Moving deeper into the nature of the Great Ones themselves, we must confront an uncomfortable truth about death and consciousness in Bloodborne's universe. The game consistently indicates that for beings of sufficient cosmic significance, death is not an ending, but a transformation of state. The Great Ones in the dungeons are referred to as slumbering, but evidence suggests their physical forms are actually deceased while their consciousness persists. Dreams without dreamers, thoughts without thinkers. This persistence of awareness beyond biological function explains why the dungeons feel so oppressively alive, despite being tombs. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, provides our clearest example of a Great One discovered within the dungeons and subsequently freed. Found by the choir in the deepest Chalice dungeons, she was brought to the surface and installed in the Grand Cathedral, where she would later form the basis for the Healing Church's most profound and terrible experiments. But consider what her presence in the dungeons means. Was she imprisoned there by the Pthumerians, or had she chosen seclusion, hiding from something even Great Ones fear? Her willingness to cooperate with the Healing Church suggests the latter, a being seeking allies against threats we can barely comprehend. The relationship between Ebrietas and the Pthumerians remains frustratingly ambiguous. Unlike other Great Ones encountered in the dungeons, she shows no signs of bondage or containment. Her chamber, when discovered, bore none of the seals and wards that mark other significant locations. This suggests she was either a voluntary resident, or perhaps something more disturbing, a guard herself, watching over deeper mysteries that even the Healing Church dared not uncover. Her grief over Rom's transformation, witnessed in the Grand Cathedral, hints at connections and relationships between Great Ones that transcend human understanding of emotion and attachment. Rom, the vacuous spider, presents another puzzle piece in understanding the dungeon's purpose. While primarily encountered in Byrgenwerth's lake, evidence of Rom's presence appears throughout the Chalice dungeons, suggesting either multiple entities bearing the same name or a single being existing across multiple dimensional spaces simultaneously. The transformation of Rom from human scholar to cosmic entity represents one of the few documented cases of successful elevation to Great One status, achieved through processes that required intimate knowledge of the dungeon's deepest mysteries. The notion that dungeons serve as both prison and sanctuary becomes clearer when we examine the nature of the beings contained within them. These Great Ones are not uniformly hostile or benevolent. They simply are, existing on frequencies of reality that occasionally intersect catastrophically with human perception. The Pthumerians might have understood this fundamental incompatibility and built the dungeons as spaces where both species could exist without mutual annihilation. Prisons for some, sanctuaries for others, and for many, both simultaneously depending on perspective and purpose. The amygdalae, those multi-armed beings clinging to cathedral walls and nightmare boundaries, appear throughout the dungeons in various states of manifestation. Some seem trapped, bound by ritual and architecture to specific chambers. Others move freely, suggesting different levels of containment or cooperation. The presence of amygdala in both the dungeons and the surface world indicates these beings either escaped their containment or were never truly contained at all, using the dungeons as anchor points for their multi-dimensional existence rather than cells for their imprisonment. This brings us to a crucial realization about the nature of containment when dealing with beings that exist partially outside three-dimensional space. How do you imprison something that experiences time non-linearly, that exists in multiple locations simultaneously, that thinks in geometries human minds cannot process? The Pthumerian solution appears to have been conceptual rather than physical. They didn't build cells but created conditions, establishing metaphysical boundaries that great ones either couldn't or wouldn't cross. The dungeons are less like prisons and more like treaties written in stone and ritual, agreements enforced by architectural will. The discovery of the dungeons by Byrgenwerth scholars marks a turning point in human history within Bloodborne's world. Master Willem's expeditions into the Labyrinth weren't simple archaeological endeavors, but deliberate attempts to contact and comprehend the Great Ones. The scholars found more than ancient ruins. They found a functioning system of cosmic containment that they barely understood and definitely couldn't control. The knowledge gained from these expeditions would split Byrgenwerth apart, creating the schism that birthed the healing church and ultimately doomed Yharnam. The Chalice, brought back from the dungeon's depths, became the foundation for everything that followed. This wasn't just an artifact, but a key to dimensional spaces that should have remained locked. The healing church's systematic exploration of the dungeons, driven by their need for old blood and cosmic knowledge, represents a gradual undoing of everything the Pthumerians built to contain or protect. Each expedition deeper into the labyrinth weakened barriers that had held for millennia. Each chalice ritual broke seals that were never meant to be broken. Consider the hubris required to believe that modern humans could succeed where the Pthumerians, beings far more advanced and intimately connected to cosmic truth, had ultimately failed. The healing church saw the dungeons as resources to be exploited, mines for blood and knowledge, never understanding they were walking into a trap that had been sprung eons ago. Every piece of old blood consumed, every great one contacted, every seal broken, brought Yharnam closer to sharing the Pthumerians' fate, transformation, elevation, and ultimate dissolution into something beyond human recognition. The systematic exploration methodology employed by the healing church reveals their fundamental misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. They treated the dungeons like a hostile territory to be conquered rather than a delicate system to be respected. The choir, the church's upper echelon of cosmic scholars, believed they could catalogue and categorize the great ones like specimens in a laboratory. This clinical approach to beings that exist partially as concept, partially as emotion, and partially as living paradox demonstrates the dangerous combination of ambition and ignorance that would ultimately transform Yharnam into a nightmare made flesh. The old blood itself, that miraculous and cursed substance that forms the basis of Yharnam's rise and fall, originates from these dungeons. But what exactly is old blood? The evidence suggests it's not simply the biological fluid of great ones, but something more fundamental, liquefied consciousness, the physical medium through which cosmic awareness can be transmitted to beings not naturally equipped to receive it. Every transfusion is a microcosmic violation of the same boundaries the dungeons were built to maintain. The blood is both gift and curse, offering transcendence at the cost of humanity, power at the price of sanity. This reinterpretation of the dungeons as a containment system for consciousness rather than physical beings explains many of their seemingly contradictory features. The ever-shifting architecture isn't random but responsive, adjusting to contain different types and levels of awareness. The ritual requirements for entry aren't arbitrary but necessary, ensuring only beings of sufficient cosmic weight can enter without being immediately annihilated by the psychic pressure within. The blood offerings aren't payment, but synchronization, attuning the hunter's consciousness to frequencies where the dungeons can be perceived and navigated. The presence of the hunters themselves in this ancient system represents the latest iteration of a cycle that has repeated countless times. The Pthumerians had their watchers and keepers, beings modified to interface with cosmic horror without complete dissolution. The scholars of Byrgenwerth transformed themselves through eyes and insight, becoming something between human and cosmic. The healing church created hunters, beings capable of operating in the liminal spaces between dream and waking, sanity and madness, human and beast. Each civilization creates its own interface for dealing with the Great Ones, and each ultimately fails in the same way, by succeeding too well. When we examine the boss encounters within the Chalice dungeons, we're not simply fighting enemies but participating in ancient rituals of challenge and judgment. The watchdog of the old lords, that burning beast of crystallized flame, isn't merely guarding treasure but testing worthiness. Its very existence, a dog transformed into living fire and fury, speaks to the Pthumerian understanding that to guard cosmic truth, one must become something beyond mortal limitation. The creature's aggression isn't hostility, but obligation, playing a role assigned eons ago in a drama whose ending was written before human history began. The Keeper of the Old Lords, mentioned earlier, deserves deeper examination as perhaps the most successful fusion of duty and transformation. These beings chose to become eternal guardians. But what drove such dedication? The evidence suggests they understood something modern hunters don't, that the dungeons aren't protecting the Great Ones from humanity, but protecting humanity from itself. Every seal broken, every depth plundered, brings closer a transformation that cannot be reversed. The Keepers fight not to kill, but to turn back, to prevent the repetition of mistakes that destroyed their entire civilization. The blood-starved beast, that poisonous creature of flayed flesh and endless hunger, represents what happens when the boundaries between human and beast completely collapse within the dungeon's influence spaces. This isn't simple beasthood as seen in Yharnam's streets, but something more fundamental, a being whose very existence is antithetical to structured reality. Its poison isn't merely toxic, but entropic, breaking down the barriers between states of matter. Fighting it means confronting the possibility that all of humanity's careful categorizations and boundaries are ultimately meaningless in spaces where different rules apply. Let's examine the critical question of whether the Great Ones imprisoned themselves voluntarily. Several pieces of evidence support this interpretation. First, the nature of the seals themselves. They're designed to be opened from the outside, suggesting they're meant to keep things in rather than out. Second, the Great One's apparent cooperation with certain human endeavors when properly approached, as seen with Ebrietas and the choir. Third, and most telling, the fact that Great Ones seem capable of existing in multiple locations simultaneously, yet choose to maintain presence in the dungeons. The concept of voluntary imprisonment makes sense when we consider the Great One's relationship with lower dimensional beings. Imagine existing as a four-dimensional entity trying to interact with a three-dimensional world. Your very presence would cause distortions, paradoxes, impossibilities that could unravel reality itself. The dungeons might serve as dimensional buffers, spaces where Great Ones can exist without their full presence, destroying everything around them. In this interpretation, the Pthumerians didn't imprison the Great Ones. They built them embassies, spaces where diplomatic contact between incompatible forms of existence could occur. But this interpretation raises troubling questions about Queen Yharnam's fate. If the Great Ones voluntarily resided in the dungeons, why was Yharnam chained? Why was her child taken by force? The evidence points to a schism within Pthumerian society, a fundamental disagreement about their relationship with the cosmic. One faction might have sought to maintain the ancient compact of guardianship, and careful contact. Another, perhaps led by Yharnam herself initially, sought to transcend their role as intermediaries and become something more. The tragedy lies not in the ambition itself, but in the discovery that some boundaries exist not as limitations, but as mercies. The concept of the dungeons as sanctuaries becomes even more complex when we consider what they might be sanctuaries from. What could threaten beings of such cosmic significance that they would choose confinement? The game hints at entities and forces beyond even the great ones. The doll speaks of flora, of the moon, of presences that exist beyond the cosmos itself. Perhaps the dungeons protect their inhabitants from something far worse than death or madness, from complete unbeing, from forces that don't just destroy, but negate existence itself. This cosmic hierarchy of threats adds layers to our understanding of the dungeon's purpose. They're not simple containers, but complex defensive structures operating on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously. The blood requirements for entry might not be keys, but identification systems, ensuring that only beings with certain cosmic signatures can enter. The ever-shifting architecture could be defensive adaptation, constantly reconfiguring to prevent intrusion by entities operating on frequencies hostile to the great ones within. The relationship between the dungeons and the dreamlands provides crucial context for understanding their true nature. The hunter's dream, the nightmare realms, and the dungeons all exist in states between standard reality and pure consciousness. But while the dreams and nightmares are clearly artificial constructs created by specific great ones for specific purposes, the dungeons predate such deliberate construction. They're older, more fundamental, possibly representing the original interface between cosmic consciousness and material reality. When hunters descend through Chalice rituals, they're not just traveling downward through physical space, but backward through conceptual time, approaching the original point where humanity first encountered the cosmic. Each layer represents not just increasing danger, but increasing proximity to fundamental truth. The deepest dungeons don't just contain the oldest secrets, they contain the first secrets, the original sins that set in motion everything that would follow. The presence of Queen Yharnam at these deepest levels isn't coincidence, but necessity. She represents the ultimate cautionary tale, the perfect synthesis of human ambition and cosmic consequence. Her eternal pregnancy symbolizes potential forever frozen, transformation begun but never completed, ascension attempted but ultimately failed. Every hunter who reaches her fight's not just a boss, but a warning, a preview of what awaits those who push too far into territories where human consciousness was never meant to venture. The fight itself operates on multiple levels of meaning. Physically, it's a battle against a powerful Pthumerian queen with command over blood and fire. Symbolically, it's a confrontation with the consequences of seeking forbidden knowledge. Metaphysically, it's participation in a ritual that exists outside normal causality, where victory and defeat become meaningless concepts. The fact that defeating her doesn't free her, but simply ends the encounter, suggests that some prisons are internal, some punishments self-inflicted, some tragedies too fundamental to reality to ever truly resolve. Her attacks during the battle tell their own story. The blood she commands isn't simply weapon but medium, each drop carrying the weight of her royal lineage and cosmic violation. When she creates blood daggers that hang in space before launching, she's demonstrating mastery over the same forces the healing church would later crudely manipulate through blood ministration. Her command over these forces, while simultaneously being victim to them, encapsulates the fundamental paradox of the Pthumerian civilization, mastery and servitude inextricably intertwined. The crying of the infant Mergo that echoes through the battle adds a layer of temporal distortion to an already surreal encounter. This child exists elsewhere, in a nightmare attended by the wet nurse, yet its cries emanate from Yharnam's still pregnant form. This impossible simultaneity suggests the dungeons exist in a space where linear causality breaks down, where effects can precede causes, where endings and beginnings occur simultaneously. Fighting Yharnam means participating in events that have already happened, are currently happening, and will happen again, trapped in cosmic loops that mock human understanding of sequence and consequence. Returning to our central question, were the Chalice dungeons prisons or sanctuaries? We must acknowledge that the answer transcends binary classification. They were both because they had to be both, serving multiple functions across multiple dimensions for multiple species of consciousness. For the great ones, they provided insulation from a reality too fragile to bear their full presence. For the Pthumerians, they offered proximity to cosmic truth while maintaining survivable distance. For humanity, they represent both ultimate temptation and ultimate warning, containing treasures that transform and truths that destroy. The architectural evidence supports this multi-purpose interpretation. The dungeons contain spaces clearly designed for different functions: ritual chambers for communication, containment cells for dangerous entities, vast halls for gathering, intimate spaces for study and meditation. This diversity of purpose suggests a civilization that understood the complexity of their relationship with the cosmic. They weren't simple jailers or worshippers, but something more nuanced, cosmic diplomats, attempting to maintain balance between incompatible forms of existence. The failure of this balance, evidenced by the Pthumerian civilization's downfall, wasn't due to simple hubris or mistake. It was perhaps inevitable, the result of prolonged contact between beings operating on fundamentally different existential frequencies. The Pthumerians' transformation from guardians to rulers, to victims, represents a pattern that would repeat with Bergenwerth, with the Healing Church, with Yharnam itself. Each iteration believes they can succeed where their predecessors failed, not understanding that the failure is not in execution, but in the attempt itself. This cyclical nature of rise and fall around the dungeons suggests they serve another purpose, as a cosmic honey trap, drawing civilizations toward transcendence they cannot actually achieve. The great ones, we know, are sympathetic in spirit and often answer when called, but their answers are not solutions. They're transformations that feel like solutions until the consequences become apparent. The dungeons facilitate this contact, enable these transformations, and preserve the evidence of what happens to those who succeed in their failures. The modern hunters exploring these dungeons represent the latest iteration of this cycle. Armed with weapons and blood ministration derived from previous explorers' discoveries, they delve deeper, fight harder, and ultimately contribute their own thread to the pattern. Each successful dungeon run that yields blood gems or ritual materials advances the hunter's power while hastening Yharnam's transformation into something beyond human recognition. The dungeons don't just contain the past, they actively shape the future through what they allow to be discovered. The multiplayer aspects of Chalice dungeon exploration, while mechanically a gameplay feature, take on narrative significance when viewed through this lens. The ability to share dungeons through glyphs, to summon help or invade others' explorations, suggests that the dungeons exist in a space where individual consciousness bleeds together. Multiple hunters can experience the same dungeon differently, fight the same bosses in different orders, find different treasures in identical locations. This isn't inconsistency, but revelation. The dungeons respond to consciousness, showing each explorer what they need to see, teaching each student the lesson they're ready to learn. The root chalices and their randomized dungeons represent perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the labyrinth's nature. These aren't simply procedurally generated variations, but glimpses into the infinite possibilities contained within the dungeon's quantum architecture. Each configuration exists simultaneously until observed, at which point it collapses into a specific arrangement tailored to the exploring consciousness. The dungeons don't just contain infinite variations. They are infinite variations, existing in superposition until the act of exploration forces them to choose a single form. This quantum nature explains why the dungeons seem both ancient and immediate, both discovered and created. When a hunter performs a chalice ritual, they're not opening a pre-existing space, but collapsing probability into actuality, forcing the infinite potential of the labyrinth to manifest in a specific configuration. The blood offering doesn't power the ritual. It provides the conscious template around which reality crystallizes. Each dungeon run is both exploration and creation, both discovering what was always there and determining what there will be. As we near the end of our exploration, we must confront the ultimate irony of the Chalice dungeons. In seeking to understand whether they were prisons or sanctuaries, we've discovered they're actually mirrors, reflecting the nature of whoever enters them. For the Pthumerians, they reflected a civilization caught between transcendence and obliteration. For the healing church, they reflected institutional hubris and the commodification of cosmic truth. For the hunters, they reflect the eternal human drive to push boundaries, to seek power, to uncover truth regardless of consequence. Queen Yharnam, in her eternal vigil at the bottom of the labyrinth, serves as the ultimate reflection of what the dungeons truly represent, the price of contact with forces beyond human comprehension. She achieved what every civilization that finds the dungeons ultimately seeks: direct contact with the cosmic, transformation beyond human limitation, power beyond mortal measure. And she stands forever as testament to why such achievements are indistinguishable from damnation, why transcendence and tragedy are merely different words for the same cosmic joke. The dungeons endure because they must endure, serving their function across deep time, waiting for the next civilization to discover them, explore them, and ultimately be transformed by them. They're not malicious or benevolent. They simply are, existing as a fundamental feature of reality in a universe where consciousness and matter intersect in ways human minds weren't meant to process. Every seal broken, every depth plundered, every boss defeated advances an agenda that no human agency set in motion and no human action can stop. In conclusion, the Chalice dungeons were never simply prisons or sanctuaries. They were and are something far more complex and terrible. They're the interface between incompatible forms of existence, the buffer zone between reality and impossibility, the membrane through which cosmic consciousness filters into material reality. They're simultaneously humanity's greatest discovery and its inevitable doom, offering power that transforms, knowledge that maddens, and truth that destroys. The Pthumerians built them, or found them, or became them, and in doing so, set in motion events that ripple through dimensions and across eons. The tragedy of Queen Yharnam reminds us that some boundaries exist not to limit, but to protect. That some knowledge comes at prices that can never be fully paid. That some transformations cannot be undone. Every hunter who descends into the Chalice dungeons participates in this ancient tragedy, adding their own verse to an epic poem written in blood and madness across the canvas of cosmic time. The dungeons don't judge or punish or reward. They simply reveal, showing each explorer the truth they're capable of comprehending and the transformation they're destined to undergo. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of gaming's most enigmatic and terrifying locations. The Chalice dungeons stand as perhaps the perfect embodiment of Bloodborne's cosmic horror, spaces where meaning breaks down, where purpose becomes paradox, where every answer raises exponentially more questions. If this exploration of forbidden knowledge and ancient tragedy resonated with you, please consider subscribing to Keen 7 Lore. Your support makes these investigations into gaming's deepest mysteries possible. And trust me, we've only scratched the surface of the horrors and wonders waiting to be uncovered. Ring the bell, join our community of lore seekers, and together we'll continue to explore the spaces between dream and nightmare, the boundaries where gaming's greatest stories reveal their darkest truths. Until next time, fellow hunters, may you find your worth in the waking world, and remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again.